Welcome to Complete Kids Online, friendly discussions about autism and other developmental disabilities. Learn how working together is working better, one conversation at a time.
Hello, welcome to Complete Kids Online. I'm Gina.
And I'm Bob.
And we are joined here today by Casey, the VP of Philanthropy at Kaleideum Museum in Winston-Salem.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
This is not our first time meeting, Casey.
As we know, we are in our current Winston-Salem clinic, and that's where we had met previously when we were transitioning into moving into this space.
And obviously, Casey this was her former residence. Is it like walking back home when you come in? And
It is like coming home when I walk back inside. I knew right where I needed to come. So, and we couldn't be happier that more kids are finding joy and success in this building. So we feel like it's the next evolution for the building, obviously.
So we also bought a building in another location. I won't say where, and you'll know why when I finish the story. But our CEO's assistant, Meredith, said, I wish they were all like the Kaleideum folks because that was seamless and painless and easy. And I guess it's not always the case when buying buildings and moving into buildings. So we appreciate that.
Well, it was our pleasure, and we're excited that y'all are here.
So let's talk about why this is kind of a little special to you, what we do and the services we provide.
So in my day job, when I'm not the VP of Philanthropy at Kaleideum, I am the mother of 3 boys, 14-year-old twins and a 12-year-old. So if you're calculating the math, that means I had 3 boys inside of 18 months, which is not at all.
Yeah, that's not ideal.
Not at all for the faint of heart. No. And so my twin boys were born a little early. And we identified that one of my kiddos had a congenital heart defect at my 19-week anatomy scan. So we knew that we were in for some challenges with him. And then certainly when I ended up delivering early, so then I had preemies who also had, one of whom had a congenital heart defect. We knew we had a lot on our plate. And pretty quickly after our boys were born, when they spot a congenital heart defect in kiddos, very frequently they want to dig a little deeper. So we did genetic testing and found that he had 22q Deletion Syndrome, which is a microdeletion on the 22nd chromosome.
I'm a total novice when it comes to this, so give me that one in layman's terms,
Yeah,
please.
so it just means, as Matt can tell you, and my boys are Mac and Wilson, as Matt can tell you, he is missing a tiny piece of his DNA. And when you think about missing a tiny piece of your DNA, it doesn't seem like it would be a big deal, right? Got a lot of DNA.
Yeah, there's trillions of them, right?
One teeny tiny piece shouldn't be a huge deal, but this piece is pretty significant. And so I jokingly say that 22q Deletion Syndrome, also called velocardiofacial syndrome, because it impacts the velo or the palate, cardio or the heart, and then facial because it is a craniofacial disorder. That it's the most common chromosomal disorder that you've never heard of. It is the most common chromosomal disorder, second only to Down syndrome, and we see it in about 1 in 2,000 to 3,000 kids. But you can't necessarily look at a kid with 22q and know exactly what's going on with them. So pretty quickly after Mac was born, they did some genetic testing, and we got his chromosomal. We figured out what his chromosomal disorder was, and so that started us on a whole other path and journey. So I mentioned that there was a cardio component, meaning that he was born with a congenital heart defect, and so he's had multiple open heart surgeries, and he received an artificial heart valve about 3 years ago. So we've got that. The palate, so a lot of kids are either born with a cleft lip or cleft palate. Mac has what's called velopharyngeal insufficiency, which means that his palate does not completely close when he speaks. So it creates some really hypernasal speech. So we've been steeped in speech therapy for a lot of years as well. Individuals with 22q can have significant learning disabilities, or like in Mac's case, you can have an intellectual disability. The palate disorder has also impacted his feeding, so he eats using a G-tube for his nutrition. And so, we've got a kid who has a lot going on. Additionally, many individuals with 22q are also somewhere on the autism spectrum. So Mac has got this whole constellation of things that make him uniquely and wonderfully different than a lot of people that you kind of run into. And then his twin brother is also on the spectrum, but it looks very different in him because he does not have the chromosomal disorder. So we are a household full of neurodiversity, which comes with its own challenges, and it also comes with its own beauty.
Right. So, we do this podcast to help other viewers, or millions of viewers that we probably have by now. So talk about, just not just the emotional part, but even just the logistical part of, parents that are maybe just brand new to this diagnosis and, navigating that world.
So any parent who has a child with exceptionalities, whether it's strictly an autism diagnosis or like our family, an autism diagnosis and significant healthcare and educational needs, it's the number of appointments and it's interesting when I look at my calendar and I don't see a doctor's appointment scheduled for the week. I don't quite know what to do because we see so many specialists, and we're seeing therapists. We're doing speech therapy. We've got ABA therapy. We're working on feeding therapy. So we have all of these different therapies that enter into our lives as well, and so it is overwhelming. In order to have all of these things to look at your calendar. I mean, when I open up my calendar as an Outlook, and he's got his own particular color, and his color takes up almost as much as like all my meetings for my actual job. And so it can be really pretty overwhelming in terms of trying to navigate those things and figure out how to get to all those appointments and do all the things that you need to do while also working, while caring for your other children. It's a lot, but I also feel so fortunate. When Mac was born, he did 7 months in the NICU, which anybody who's ever done any time in the NICU says that one day feels like an eternity. So if you're in there for 7 months, know you've got a lot going on. And by the time he came home, I've said, his twin brother was already sitting up. He was eating solid foods, and Mac was just barely out of the NICU. And so we connected really early on with the CDSA. Like, they were in my home within probably days.
That's who, Casey?
The Children's Developmental Services Agency. And so in the state of North Carolina, those folks are providing early intervention services for children. And so if, like, you're my boys and you spent some time in the NICU, that's kind of a natural progression. We know that kids who are premature tend to have more developmental delays and things like that. So it's kind of a natural sort of evolution. You kind of receive those referrals when you come out. But there are plenty of kids who also, parents realize that their kids are maybe a little slow to walk or to talk and develop language, things like that. And so you can certainly seek a referral to the CDSA through your pediatrician as well. And so they're really coming into the home providing appropriate services based on what your child needs. And so in Mac's case, that was speech, that was PT, that was OT, that was a whole host of therapies that he was receiving in our home. And at the time, I mean, Mac was on continuous feeds through his G-tube, he was on oxygen, he was on a heart monitor, an apnea monitor at all times. And so at that point in time, we couldn't really enroll him in school or preschool. There's not a lot of preschools that are raising their hand to take that kid. And fortunately, in Winston-Salem, we have a public-private partnership that provides school services and preschool services for kids with some complicated medical needs. And so around 3, he was able to start there and begin to get services, and we were able to get his therapies through them. But, you know, that was from the moment we came home. One of my first things, and probably it's because my mother is an early interventionist, that I was ready to jump on it so quickly, but I knew, you know, we had been in the hospital and I had been surrounded by specialists. You know, OT was coming in and speech was coming in the hospital. And so I wanted to keep that continuity when we got home because I knew how important it was. I knew he had a lot of things stacked against him in terms of his development and things like that. And so I wanted to make sure he had access to all of those therapies because I knew how incredibly important early intervention was, and that the earlier we could intervene on some of those challenges, the more successful he would be. And so even with all of our aggressive therapies, he was 4 before he was walking. He was talking at kind of a similar age. We're 14 and we still need a G-tube for our nutrition. So even with really aggressive, a really aggressive approach to therapy, you know, we still were slower to meet those developmental milestones, but we did reach those developmental milestones, and he just did it on his own path.
Which is nice. I mean, you know, at least he got there, right?
Yeah.
So you talked about, you know, I had a conversation recently with Alex, who's a member of our psych department, and he was saying, so when you got these diagnoses, were you surprised?
You know, I was surprised when we got the congenital heart defect diagnosis at our 19-week anatomy scan. And as soon as we got that, they started sort of preparing us just a little bit for what they thought could be. And I think our doctor certainly said 22q Deletion syndrome was likely. We did not do any genetic testing, so we didn't know till he came out. But I think as a parent, even if you're somewhat prepared, you know, I talk frequently about, you know, I know why they call it expecting when you're pregnant, because you have all of these expectations about how things are going to go and what it's going to be like. And so, you know, it's difficult. It's hard to have to wrap your mind around this new reality, and whether you have to start doing that at your 19-week anatomy scan, or whether you do that when your kiddo is 2 or 3 and they start losing some skills or something like that. It's hard, and it's hard whether you have warning, and it's hard whether you don't have warning.
Yeah, his insight was that most parents, not all, but most, they kind of know.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like, oh my God, I got this diagnosis that I had no idea was coming. He said it's the opposite, that most parents kind of have an intuition about it.
Well, and you know, I've said that Mac was a lot later to get his autism diagnosis, which, as I understand it, and I'm certainly not a psychologist, as I understand it, is pretty common among individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities when it's a comorbid condition with autism. But you know, for me, when we finally got our autism diagnosis, a little bit, it was like, well, to your point, yeah, I kind of knew that. And now we have a diagnosis, and so that really means wonderful things in terms of his ability to access services through the school district. It means wonderful things in terms of being able to access services through our insurance company or Medicaid. He has a Cap C waiver, which in North Carolina is a Medicaid waiver that is not dependent on income. It's based on a child's extra special health care needs. And so, for Mac, he had a Cap C waiver starting at around 4, which means that he has his primary health insurance, which we have through my husband's work, and then he has his Medicaid waiver as well. But all of that, you know, there's a lot to be said about once you get the diagnosis, even if you're surprised or you're not surprised, at least at that point, you're like, okay, now we can do something. Now the door is open for us to get more services through the school district if you're in the school district. Or now the door is open for us to start talking to our insurance company and Medicaid about ABA services or increasing speech therapy or OT or whatever it may happen to be. And so I think there's a lot to be said about just knowing, so that then you can move forward. You know, for a long time I always said that Mac at least had a toe on the line. You know,
Right.
We knew that it was likely. You know, it was never his sort of flashing light diagnosis. His genetic condition has always been sort of the primary thing that has shaped our journey. But knowing that autism is a part of his constellation of diagnoses and things like that is incredibly important and helpful to us as parents as we work to kind of make sure that he can access all the services that he needs, whether they're therapeutic services, educational services, or medical services.
So any advice you would give parents, you know, either recently getting a diagnosis or even back it up before then when they start to suspect maybe they should get a diagnosis? Any advice that you would give them, you know, as somebody that's been through it already?
You know, I think number one, I think that we're in a much better position in terms of acceptance now than
These
we
days,
once
yes.
were. I think there were times years ago when there was a much greater stigma around an autism diagnosis, and it's wonderful that I don't think that stigma exists in the same way that it did. I think we're also incredibly fortunate that we now have access to so many therapeutic services, and that we can, you know, because for a long time, especially in North Carolina, which was so late to autism insurance reform, you got a diagnosis and then you couldn't really do anything.
Right.
You know, you couldn't access services, you couldn't access ABA, and so for a while it was like, okay, so I've got this diagnosis, now what do I do? And now I think we're at a place in North Carolina where you get the diagnosis, and now it's not what do I do? A little bit it's that, but now it's, okay, so where can I go to get resources, and how can I access those? And so for me, I think that it is, you know, when you're a parent and you get the diagnosis, whether it's an autism diagnosis or some other kind of diagnosis, because we've gotten lots of them, I think that there's so much power in knowing and being able to move forward in terms of accessing appropriate services for your kid. And I've always said, you know, we see a lot of medical specialists. You know, we have hours-long IEPs in the public school system. We see lots of therapists and things like that. And I look to these folks to be experts in their field. But I'm the expert in MAC. And I specialize in my kid, and I specialize in knowing where his strengths are and where his challenges are. And you have never met a fiercer advocate for their kid. And I think that most parents are like that. I think that we all have different levels of education, different levels of family support, different levels of sort of financial support. I think we all come to it from a different place, but I think all of us want what's best for our kids. And so I really go into it as saying I need to be incredibly present as a part of his speech therapy, and you know, in the same way that I'm taking notes in doctor's appointments and things like that. You know, it's interesting because you don't have, you know, I've had this conversation with his speech therapist. You know, he sees her for 2 30-minute sessions a week, but he does not just have speech and language challenges for an hour a week. You know, and so making sure that I know what they're working on in speech, so that I can further reinforce that at home, so that we can practice whatever he's working on. If it's irregular verbs, He also has some dysfluency, so understanding the techniques that his speech therapist used to kind of help him when he's getting stuck on a word to kind of, and dysfluency is another word for what we used to call a stutter. And so if I don't know those things, if I don't know what he's working on in therapy, just like if I don't know what he's working on in math at school, I can't help to support him because, yes, I count on my therapist to help us and to be the experts. But if we are not supporting the work that they're doing in home and in the community and things like that, we can only expect so much progress if it's only being reinforced in a therapeutic setting or an educational setting. It's kind of like, to me, if I go see my doctor and I take him to go see his doctor and they're like, you should really take this medication, but I don't give him the medication, and I can't just show up at the cardiologist again in 6 months and be like, yeah, things are not working out the way I wanted them to. It's really the responsibility is on us as his parents to make sure that we are reinforcing all of those things that that he's learning in therapy, so that he can be his most successful self.
Yeah.
I know this is hitting hard home with our former SLP sitting here with me.
No, it's true. I mean, the research supports the more you practice those skills across different settings, and increases generalization. It's not meant to be a one-stop, drop my kid off and
He comes back.
everything's, like we're clinicians, not magicians, is the whole, as the saying goes.
I haven't heard that, but yes, absolutely.
So maybe chat about that real briefly, Casey, about the importance of, like you said, you're an advocate for your kid, but also understanding, it seems like you do understand that it doesn't end the minute the kid walks out of the clinic.
Well, I mean, and we've been doing lots of therapies for lots of different years, and so having that really open conversation and dialogue with your therapist, whether it's ABA or speech or OT, what are we working on? And really, it's a dialogue with me and Mac's therapist, because, I can say, especially as Mac is getting older, he's 14 years old now, he's incredibly aware of the fact that it is really difficult for people to understand him. And I jokingly say, I speak Mac fluently. I understand about 95% of everything that he says, but that is not true of most people who interact with him. And so it's really important to me to make sure that I'm like, okay, these are the things we need to continue working on in speech therapy, and how can we continue to reinforce the things he's working on around his dysfluency and some of his other communication delays, but also then seeking out and saying, as a 14-year-old, he's going to be less sort of surrounded by his grown-ups as he gets a little bit more independent, which is what we want for him. It's what we want for all of our kids. And so making sure that we then have the conversation, is it time to introduce OGCOM? Are there some other things that we can do to help him be his most successful self? How can we support him, and how can we work together? Because again, a speech therapist or an ABA therapist, they're experts in what they know. But I'm an expert in my kid, and if I'm not an active participant in that therapy, in terms of what we want Mac to achieve and what Mac wants to achieve, it's interesting. When we look at kiddos who are on the spectrum, parents frequently talk about their kiddos' special interests, right? And so Mac has one of his favorite things is the Titanic. So he has a very specialized interest in the Titanic. He can tell you most anything you want to know. And then, interestingly, he also has a really specialized interest in hotels. Specifically, and there's going to be a little bit of parent judgment here, the hotels that were featured in the movie The Shining, because he watched a documentary on the making of The Shining, and it focused a lot on the hotels, so he got really interested in the hotels. And so if you ask Mac right now, what does he want to do? He will tell you that he wants to work in a hotel one day. And so it was interesting when he had his most recent neuropsych eval, she said, what are Mac's goals? And I said, he wants to work in a hotel. She's like, that would be a great job for Mac. He's so friendly. He's so outgoing. She was like, okay, so as you're moving into his IEP meeting, as you're moving into his transition plan, because he's 14 years old, how do you help him get there? And so it really is, in everything we're doing, it is a part of a larger conversation. And I'm constantly bringing in, my therapy notes into the classroom with his teachers and saying, here's one of the things that we're really struggling with, or here are some, I know that disfluency is a real challenge for him right now. It gets him really frustrated. If you see that in the classroom, here are some tips and techniques that we've been given that you may want to try it in the classroom setting to help him sort of navigate and sort of power through some of those areas. And so when we look at things like that, it really is, I'm bringing therapy into the educational setting. I'm taking it into, he does therapeutic horseback riding. He does all sorts of things, and it's amazing how much intersection there is. But more than anything, it's just making sure that I am incredibly well-versed on what's happening at school, what's happening in therapy sessions, what's happening medically with him, so that I can be his advocate in all of these different settings. Because anyone who has a child who has significant healthcare challenges, significant educational challenges, and behavioral challenges as well, there are all of these intersections, and making sure that we're constantly finding sort of that red thread that runs through them all means that that's how he's his most successful self. Because if we look at him, at Kaleideum, we often talk about how learning doesn't happen in these silos. It's not science here and math here and arts here and literacy here. There's these overlapping lenses, and it's through those overlapping lenses that we get our most robust learning, and it's very similar. Mac does not learn speech in his 1 hour of speech therapy every week, and so it really is those overlapping lenses that help him to be his most successful self.
There's a reason the parent is part of the IEP team. Like, it's a team effort in the school, out of the school, and everyone's, kind of there to help
And
them
I
along.
would say, really, and I think it'll be interesting. I would have said, a few years ago that the parent is the most important person in the IEP team. But now that Mac is 14 and is getting ready to go into his first IEP meeting with me as a part of that, I look forward to him being a part of that conversation and that dialogue as well. And I know that for some kids, they may not be able to be an active participant in those IEP discussions, and Mac will have limited input. But I need him to help us know, what does he need to be his most successful self? What does he need in order to most efficiently and effectively navigate his classroom setting, navigate school, navigate those social interactions, all of those things that he runs up against. And so, I think the other people in the room are important, but certainly I think that Mac and I are the most important ones going into those conversations.
It's so cool to see down the line, because we mostly see kids, 2 to 10. But those kids grow up and they go to school and they have to learn how to
young
advocate for
adults.
themselves. And it's really cool to see, down the line, what comes of, our kids here in the clinic.
Because it's the one thing is our kids grow up. And so, the challenges that you have when your kid is 2 are very different than the ones that you encounter when you're 14. But the more we can intervene and the earlier we can intervene, the more successful our kids are going to be. And that's true whether you have a kid with autism, it's true whether you have a kid with speech and language delays or other, whether it's gross motor delays or fine motor delays or graphomotor, whatever it happens to be. The earlier we spot something and the earlier we can say, you know what, I think we need to dig a little bit more deeply here. And so, we should never be afraid to, raise our hand at our pediatrician's appointment and say, you know what, I think there's something going on here. And so,
Well, to your point, you see that kid every day. That pediatrician sees the kid a couple months, maybe. I don't know, certain cases, a couple weeks, but most of the time, every couple months. Like, who knows better?
and if it's a well child visit, they've got like 15 minutes
Right.
to check their ears and listen to their heart and talk about whether they're eating nutritiously and doing all of those things. And to your point, I'm there all the time. And so the more we can raise our hand if we think that's something going on, and the more that we can be receptive to that messaging when it comes to us as parents. That, when somebody says, I think there might be something going on here, I think we could benefit from some therapeutic interventions. It's not a condemnation on us as parents. It's not a condemnation of our kids. It just means that we maybe need a little extra support to help them get where they need to go. And so making sure that, and don't be afraid to push back. Mothers of boys see it all the time. He'll talk when he's got something he needs to say.
Yeah.
We see that all the time. But as a parent, you said this earlier, lots of times even if somebody hasn't told you yet, even if somebody hasn't diagnosed anything yet, maybe it's because you've had other children, maybe because it's just you see your kid interact at childcare or with cousins at family outings or whatever. To not let yourself be steamrolled. And if you have concerns, to be okay, find your voice and make sure that people are listening and that you're getting those referrals. The worst thing that's going to happen is you seek a referral and they're going to be like, you know what, everything's fine. We did the testing and everything's good. And that's an okay path too. But the earlier we can sort of raise alarms and say, let's look into this, the more successful we'll ultimately be over time.
Oh, my psych team, I can hear them clapping right now after you said that, because they're always on about early. So what about the importance of, I get it, life gets in the way, Casey. So a parent is prescribed X amount of hours. We find sometimes it's just hard to get those parents in. Now, sometimes it's, again, life just getting in the way. But sometimes I think it's that they don't understand the importance of consistency and bringing the kid in for the required amount of time.
I've always thought of it and in terms of like when my pediatrician prescribes a medication, or when our cardiologist, after we got our heart valve, we were prescribed aspirin every day to keep his heart valve from clotting off or whatever. I think of therapeutic dosage in much the same way. When we are told that we need to provide a particular medication and it's explained to us why it's so important, I don't think it occurs to most parents to say, we're just not going to do that.
Right.
And so for me, I think about those therapeutic recommendations or dosages in very much the same way. It is tough. Mac has a compromised immune system, and we do weekly infusions of immunotherapy that takes us about an hour, and he's hooked up in my living room. We do it every Sunday morning. That gets in the way too, but I know that that's what we have to do in order to keep Mac healthy. And so when we receive therapeutic recommendations, this is what we need to do to make sure that Mac is his most successful self. In terms of therapeutic interventions, I really look at it in much the same way that I look at his medicine dosages. To me, it's not an option. It's what we need to do to help him succeed and to be healthy and happy.
Yeah, I was going to ask you another question. It sounds like you basically answered, but my next question was, so how can we, as someone that's sitting at the other side of the table, explain to these parents that this kind of thing is important, but it seems like you kind of nailed that one already.
But yeah, I think that but I'm not.
Because what do we, it's frustrating for us because we know it will help the kid. How do we convey that to parents to understand the importance of this for the kid's benefit?
Well, and I think that, so much parents are coming from in all different places, right? You've got We've got kiddos who are in two-parent households where they're the only child, and you don't have the complications of siblings and things like that. You have, so parents are coming from a variety of different places in terms of, and I've always worked in jobs where I have more flexibility to go to appointments and to do things like that. So I recognize that I'm sitting in a place of privilege. And so I acknowledge that, and I recognize that other families have different life circumstances that can make it harder to navigate those doctor's appointments and navigate those therapies and things like that. But what I would say is, number one, if you think about it in the same way that you think about medication, and that it wouldn't occur to you to not give your child the medicine that they need for their heart or something like that, if you look at it through a similar lens, I think that it starts to sort of change your, it changes your perspective a little bit. I think the other thing is, and as parents, you know, to a certain extent, we don't know what we don't know, right? But I think it's also really important as parents, in the same way that we need to be experts on our kids, is that we need to be experts on the services that are available, and how we can access them. I mentioned that Mac had a Cap C Medicaid waiver. Well, when we have primary health insurance and then a secondary Medicaid, it makes the costs associated with substantial investments in healthcare and therapies and things like that much easier for a family to bear. And so figuring out what resources are available to you and how to access those can very frequently take the burden off of families, whether it's a financial burden, whether it's a burden of time, things like that. I think can make a really considerable difference, because I think when we as parents are better educated, better informed, we can make better choices on behalf of our children. And so I just say to parents, I get it. I know it's so hard. But if you had told me that the kiddo that spent the first 7 months in the NICU and wasn't walking and wasn't talking, had failure to thrive, all sorts of things like that. I mean, he's thriving in ways now that I would have never thought possible. And I really think that a large portion of that, certainly we've had top-notch medical care, and that's been tremendous. But we've invested a lot of time and energy in therapeutic interventions as well, so that he can communicate with us, so that he can express his challenges and frustrations in ways that we can understand and respond to. And so our investment along the way is paying dividends now. And it's hard to see that sometimes when you're looking at, I've got this doctor's appointment, and we've got speech, and we've got OT, and things like that. And it's one of the reasons why places like this are so wonderful, where you can get multiple therapies in the same location. It's such a tremendous blessing to parents who are trying to navigate all of these different options and trying to make them available to their kids. And so having it all under one roof is incredible.
We're definitely happy to be moved in and be here. So what's going on with the new museum? What's new for you guys?
What's new? We are so excited. We are having this conversation today on October 30th. We have started moving exhibits into the new museum. We are scheduled to do our ribbon cutting on February 15th, and then we will open our doors wide to the public on Saturday, February 17th of 2024. And so it has been a long time coming. It has been quite the journey, but we just couldn't be any more excited about opening our doors to the new museum and welcoming our community in.
Yeah, when we were over, we saw the renderings of the videos of the new space, and it just looks incredible.
Just wait till you see it in person.
Well,
You're
we're
going to be
getting a
astounded.
sneak peek today, which I'm very excited about.
Yeah, absolutely.
We know people. So I'm going to ambush you. We always end on a question, and I should have fed it to you before so you could think about it, so I apologize. So if you're going to be mad at me. So we have the little superheroes that represent our four disciplines: speech, OT, PT, and ABA. So we always ask our guests if you could have any superpower, what would that be?
Invisibility.
And why is that?
You know, I've always liked the idea of kind of seeing what happens when I'm not in the room. Like, it's true.
Oh, so you
like,
want it for the fly on the wall reason?
I want it for the fly on the wall reason. I do. I want to. I think that I think it would be amazing to kind of be able to sort of skulk in the background just a little bit. But you know, it's funny that you have superheroes because I have always said that Mac is my biggest hero in terms of all of the challenges that have put before him and how he has, you know, scaled tall buildings and, you know, there really seems to be no end in sight to what he is able to accomplish. And so yeah, I think maybe if I were choosing a superhero, I think I would choose Mac Raymer as my superhero.
That's sweet. Yeah, this is great discussion.
Yeah, that really
useful.
informative. Really appreciate it. Hopefully it helps out a lot of our folks. Definitely go see when the new place opens. Go and tell them Casey sent you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And if anybody at home, you know, some of these questions that Casey kind of went over, if you have more questions or you're really overwhelmed, feel free to stop in any of the clinics, whether you're a client of ours or not, and we'll do the best we can to, you know, help you guys out.
Yeah, and if you're in the Winston-Salem area, be sure to check out Kaleideum. In February, we're excited.
We are too. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To continue the conversation, visit the links to our website, Facebook page, or Instagram in the comments.